It Chapter 2 was released in 2019, directed by Andy Muschietti, and stars an ensemble cast which includes James McAvoy, Bill Hader, and Jessica Chastain. It's the follow-up to the very successful part one, essentially, of It, which came out in 2017. Um, a film that I generally quite liked. The child actors were very strong. It was the dramatic elements I thought worked more than the horror elements, but it remained a solidly entertaining film. It's of course based on the book by Stephen King, which came out in the 1980s. Uh, an okay book. I read it when I was in my sort of early teens, and I read it more recently actually as well. It's fine. I think I understand that it resonates with quite a lot of people. I think because it's a coming of age story, because it's about like friendship and the transition from childhood to adulthood, and it's about nostalgia and memory. And I can see why it resonates with quite a lot of people. Um, and from that perspective, I think it's fine. It's an entertaining story if a little sort of implausible when you start to get into the story. And then you've the 1990 TV miniseries of it is a bit of a mess. The second half is terrible, but I do retain quite a soft spot for it. I mean, I think I do watch that miniseries maybe once every year or so. It does have an appeal to me. Um, so I was excited to see what they did with the remake of it. And having liked the first installment, I was excited to see this follow up. Um, Sadly, I was disappointed with this movie. I thought it was a step down from the first It movie. I thought it got quite overindulgent. I thought a lot didn't work in terms of the pacing, in terms of the horror elements. I'll go into what kind of ruined the film for me in a minute. But first, I do want to sort of praise the film because it's not a disaster. I mean, in terms of horror films that I've seen in the past 5 years or so, it's certainly not amongst the worst. There are far worse horror movies out there, um, and I do like that this is one that's reached a larger audience than other horror films have. So some things in the film work. I mean, the casting's first rate. I know that a lot of attention's been paid to this. The adults, for the most part, do seem like adult versions of the children from the first movie, with the exception maybe of James McAvoy. He was the only one I felt didn't really work from that perspective, which is a shame because he's a solid actor. But I thought the casting overall was fine. One or two of the horror elements worked. I mean, probably the best put together scene in the film is the introduction. Where you've got where it's the dairy, the dairy bullies essentially, like viciously assault the gay couple, which is straight out of the book. It's a really disturbing scene. I think it's more disturbing than any of the stupid clown stuff that comes later on. Although Pennywise does show up in that scene, and it works as a horror scene, I think, because you've got that disturbing undercurrent to it of the homophobic attack, but then also Pennywise is kind of in the distance, and it's quite subtle. It's a well put together scene. And similarly, later on, you've got the scene with the little girl that he lures under um, the stand, or the bleachers. That's the word I was looking for. He lures the little girl under the bleachers with the firefly, and that scene's quite creepy, quite unsettling. So you've got at least two effective horror scenes in the film, which work, and that's fine. Um, and the direction to the film's fine. There's no issues. There's no issues there. Um, and it does work on a dramatic level. The performances are all good, I think. People have talked about Bill Hader. Yeah, he does quite well. His performance was fine. He does have an arc in the film that I thought worked, but the comedic stuff with him I found really tedious. I have to be honest. I cringed every time he pops out one of these one liners or tries to be funny or something. I mean, it works to build chemistry with the group, but overall, I thought that character was kind of sort of ill-conceived. Um, but the rest of most of the actors are fine. I mean, I may as well just get into what didn't work for me in the film. Right off the bat, the pacing to this film is really, really off. They, I guess you could say they diversified the film a bit too much in terms of the plot. In terms of the plot, they diversified it a bit too much because really, it's an ensemble film. You've got seven main characters, so you've essentially got seven main strands that the plot can go in. But then they make the really, really misguided decision to bring back the child actors from the first film for really elongated flashbacks to the point where the plot strands are essentially multiplied. You've got 14 different plot strands that the film can go into. And in my view, that was a really poor decision for a feature film. I think that's too much. That's more the sort of thing you would put in a miniseries. Because the film really it just feels so padded out. A lot of the scenes that happen in it, particularly, they have to find, each of the characters have to find a trinket that was important to their youth. I mean, that takes up like a solid hour and a half of the film, and every scene that happens there could have happened in any order, and I think when there's no escalation throughout it, I think that doesn't, for me in pacing terms, that doesn't really work for a film. And I felt kind of sad because I was bored through a lot of it. And yeah, and in terms of the horror, well, actually, I should comment first that the stuff with the child actors in this film didn't work for me. I think they should have completely sort of removed that. Because I guess they had it in because the kid actors were one of the best parts of the first movie. They were very popular. I gather from reading up on this that they digitally de-aged the children by like 2 years, and they used pitching to unbreak their voices, essentially. And even when I watched it in the cinema, I knew there's something off with those scenes. I thought it was maybe just sort of glossy camera work, but watching it again, it does look quite off, and I wish they hadn't done it because it's very, very distracting. And quite redundant, really. I mean, I don't think many of those scenes with the kids really added anything. And in a film that's 2 hours and 50 minutes, which for a horror film is ridiculous. I mean, I guess I'd give this film a pass if it was good because it's a horror and a drama, but I think for horror films, if they're over the 90-minute mark, then they really need to justify their existence. Because I remember seeing, The Conjuring 2, which is like a 2.5-hour movie, and that film is good. It's quite scary. A lot of the scares are well put together. It's very suspenseful. But I remember it got to a point where I was just thinking, you know what? I just want this to end. 2.5 hours of being on the edge of your seat it's a little too much. I don't see anyone getting any enjoyment out of that. But as I've said in previous videos, excessive length is not a criticism. It's the pacing, because some of the longest films feel short and some of the shortest films feel long. The horror in this film, I guess this is a problem that the first film had partially as well. A lot of the horror in this film does not work. Well, I'll rephrase it. You've got these scenes that start off kind of creepy. There's something scary perhaps in the background. You see a shadow move or a door close or something. It's something very subtle. And that's creepy, where you don't know what's going to happen. And I think subtle is the key word. But of course, none of the scenes end like that. I mean, I'm thinking of the projection scene in the first film, and also maybe the scene where Beverly, played by Jessica Chastain, visits like the old woman. The scenes start off subtle, but they can't just end subtly. They can't just let the scene finish. For some reason, they have to throw in like this CGI nonsense. It's not scary. It's just so loud and so sort of ugly to look at, and I just don't understand why they do it. I mean, that scene in particular that I'm thinking of with Jessica Chastain starts off genuinely creepy, but then it's like some giant monster that comes out and attacks that looks like a cartoon, with googly eyes, and it completely deflated all tension for me, and it didn't really work. The horror just, and the horror is a key element to the film, and for me, for that not to work is, it's kind of a big deal. Too much inappropriate comedy was another criticism that I sort of identified. I mean, most of it coming from Bill Hader, actually. You have these scary scenes that are trying to be scary, but then they undercut them with a joke. And I think what's possibly happened actually is that they've made these scenes, and then in post production, they've realised that they're not scary. They don't really work, so they think, oh well, we may as well just undercut them with a joke. And for me, that takes me out of the film a little bit, because that's me seeing the post production decisions in the film. That's me thinking about that as opposed to just watching the film. And as I said earlier, the humour just made me cringe. There wasn't. I mean, it's not a film for comedy, and a lot of it just completely falls flat. And then, oh god, the ending to this film. I mean, I mentioned earlier that It Book is not a supremely logical story. Stephen King has come up with a lot of crazy fantasy nonsense in his life that does not translate well from book to film. And I think it's, if you're adapting this book into a film, it's always going to be tricky trying to justify things. So I mean, the ending to this film I thought was complete nonsense. I honestly it reminded me of the ending to of one of these mad superhero films where a city's getting destroyed and there's things exploding and people being shot, and you just want to close your eyes because it's too much. I really don't understand what they were trying to do with it, because it was just sort of nauseating. I was sitting there rubbing my temples like, oh god, please, when will this stop? Because it was just so, it was, for for a horror film to have this kind of action ending, I just felt was quite inappropriate, and to me it didn't really work, unless, I mean, you can get blends of horror and action. I mean, I'm thinking of something like the Hills Have Eyes remake, I mean, which is not a film I want to watch again. That was a pretty disturbing film, but it kind of went from a horror film to an action film, and it works fine. But I don't really think that was appropriate in this case. Yeah, and also, I'm sorry, I made a note of another scene that was like that, the Paul Bunyan scene, which starts off kind of subtle and creepy, but then ends with the Paul Bunyan statue chasing Bill Hader around and trying to decapitate him with an axe and stuff, and it's way too over the top. It's not subtle, and yeah, the film didn't really work for me, which is a shame. I mean, the plot, it's the same problem as the TV miniseries. The plots of it, the space clown turtle or whatever it is, it's possibly too nebulous to really put to screen. Because for a film, you need to have things a bit more defined. I think, and having it so ambiguous is not great. But overall, I didn't think the film was complete nonsense. Although I was intensely irritated watching it. There was issues with the pacing, issues with the horror, inappropriate comedy, way too much CGI, inappropriate tone, I would say. The ending just gave me a headache. I didn't really care for it. And yeah, it's strange to me that a film can be 2 hours and 50 minutes and actually just leave you with nothing. So yeah, I mean, as a rating, I'm going to give it 44 out of 100. Which part of me feels as being a bit generous, but I mean, it was a well produced movie. I guess you could say there is a lot of talent there. It's just buried under a massive heap of nonsense, really. So unfortunately, unlike the first movie, I can't really recommend it.